Hello and welcome to the Rodgers Brief. I'm Adam Rodgers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. This is the first in a new version of the Rodgers Brief. Those that have been listening for any length of time, months, I've been covering the Mass Casualty Commission in Nova Scotia on a daily basis, providing daily summaries of the commission as it unfolded. Those proceedings are done now, so the new version of this podcast, this YouTube series, is going to cover a range of stories. So I'm going to do a weekly video, and each week I'll cover 4, 5, 6 stories that are in the news, stories that you'll be familiar with and that have a legal angle that is either underappreciated as part of the story, or else it's just something that I think you'll find interesting and I want to discuss. So this week, for example, I'm going to be talking about the Emergencies Act inquiry that's going on, that started this week in Ottawa. I'm going to be talking about the Hockey Canada controversy, the fallout from all of the sexual assault allegations from 2018 and all that's happened with Hockey Canada since. It's been back in the news this week because one of the issues of the non-disclosure agreements that were signed in that case, that's come up in the news in PEI Nova Scotia as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about Dalhousie Homecoming in Halifax, the street parties that were held during Dalhousie's homecoming weekend, some of the legal angles there. And then something that's a Nova Scotia story and maybe Northeast Nova Scotia local, which is the consolidation of the town and county of Antigonish. So I'll talk about those 4, and then I'm going to come back to, people would be familiar from the Mass Casualty Commission with this meeting, this sort of infamous conference call that took place between the national RCMP leadership and the Nova Scotia leadership. Different accounts of that meeting throughout the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings. Well, this week the Mass Casualty Commission released 3 recordings of that, which cover about 23 minutes of the meeting itself. So some very interesting things that come out of that, and so I'm going to discuss that. I'll come back to that at the end. By the way, on the Mass Casualty Commission, just remind people that my report, my competing or alternate report to the official report, is out now as an ebook. I'll link to it in the description, in the YouTube description here. The official version of the Mass Casualty Commission's final report is not coming out until the end of March. I've compiled an alternate version. It's an easy read, can be read just in a few hours. In that, I call for I build a case for, and I call for the replacement of the RCMP in Nova Scotia. Talk about all the things that went wrong with the Mass Casualty Commission itself as an inquiry, some of which were commented also this week in an article on CBC with Professor Ed Ratushny, who wrote the book on inquiries, supporting many of the same points that I made. And also I go through sort of step by step what really happened over the course of those 13 hours. So I think it's an interesting read, and so if you're interested in that, just click on the link in the description to the video below. All right, so first story is the Emergencies Act inquiry in Ottawa. First thing I thought, okay, so the official thing, this is about the trucker convoy, the freedom convoy, the occupation, which was an interesting question in itself. I was wondering how, when the media covered this inquiry, what were they going to call it? And it's officially called the Public Order Emergency Commission, but it could have, things take on a name of their own. Sometimes, they may take on the name of the judge that's hearing it. They may take on other names. It's not been called in the media the Trucker Convoy Inquiry or the Freedom Convoy Inquiry or the Rouleau Inquiry. That's the justice who's hearing it. It has been referred to as the Emergency Act Inquiry, which puts the emphasis properly where it should be, which is on the government who enacted the Emergency Act to oppose the truckers, the occupiers, the protesters. So just some notes for people that have been following my critiques of the Mass Casualty Commission. I'll say about the Emergency Act inquiry, there is one commissioner who is a recently sitting judge, which is a good thing, contrary to the Mass Casualty Commission. Also distinct from the Mass Casualty Commission, they did, in the Emergencies Act inquiry, allow opening statements from all parties, so we know where everybody stands, what we expect to hear from them throughout, which was also a good thing. They started out with witnesses instead of the Mass Casualty Commission with presentations from lawyers and all these panels. The Emergencies Act inquiry, we are hearing witnesses, and those witnesses are being cross-examined within time limits. So it's all working very normally as an inquiry, and so just procedurally, I'm seeing things that are positive signs there. So who's involved? The federal government's involved, of course. Some of the provinces, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta for sure. Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the City of Ottawa, the residents of Ottawa have representation, and the Ottawa Police, among others. So, and individual officers have some representation as well. So far, after week one, it's not really looking very great for the government. We've seen Alberta saying they didn't need the Emergencies Act in the Coutts border crossing situation. What's really emerging is that the Ottawa police were really disorganized, and there was no credible threats of espionage, foreign influence, or really serious or credible attempts to overthrow the government by violence. No national security threats have been identified. You think they would be leading off with these things had they been clearly established. And then we also hear from the police this week that one of the biggest problems they had was that the Liberal politicians, the federal politicians, kept escalating things and, making, they were using escalating rhetoric to describe the protesters, which was really inaccurate and really inflamed things rather than try to settle things down. Now, what emerged in the evidence this week was really interesting. Like, the police knew some things about the protesters when they were coming, had been receiving warnings that they're going to be here for 30 days, they're booking hotel rooms for a month, and it sounds like there was some negotiation that took place between the police and the protest leadership, such as it was, that there'd be a limit on the number of trucks, that they'd be allowing lanes of traffic to flow through so that they wouldn't entirely freeze the downtown traffic core. So sort of like, in a way, the Occupy movement from a few years ago, but a little more disruptive. There's two sides to a protest, in a sense. There's the police side, and then there's the political side. And, the length of the protest in many ways depends on political decision makers. Are you going to agree to the demands or not? And if you don't, well, they're going to stick around until you do, or till some other compromise is reached. But maintaining order within that context is up to the police. And in this case, they really didn't get off to a good start. Instead of allowing lanes of traffic or limited numbers of trucks, they just didn't seem to be present when the protesters were showing up. They didn't, maintain a lane of traffic or any of these things that they had talked about prior to everybody showing up. And so what's emerging is that the solutions to the protest, such as it was, were practical and not legal. In other words, they didn't need any other legal avenues to move the trucks or do any of these things. Those were just practical things, and the police really didn't really seem that organized. They weren't working with the provincial or the federal police very well. So we'll see. On the government side, what's big picture? What does the government do? Well, you can either negotiate with the protesters, or you can overpower them with laws or with force. And so the Emergencies Act, the invocation of the Emergencies Act with, going after bank accounts, doing all those things, is really the government using its power, to fight the protesters rather than negotiate with them or doing anything in that sense. So it'll be interesting to follow. I'm sure, covering the Emergencies Act inquiry further as the weeks unfold. So, next story, Hockey Canada. All right, so this is, not a fresh story. It's been in the news, over the past, weeks and a couple of months. There's been a report from former Justice Cromwell on governance of the Hockey Canada. The board is gone. The leadership is gone. That's all going to be renewed this fall. But some of the legal issues that are, outstanding or that were involved in this were, I thought, interesting. And it brought me back to another case that I worked on long ago, which was the Diocese of Antigonish case. Because the issue is, and this has come up this week in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, was these non-disclosure agreements. What are you supposed to do? There's a sexual assault allegation, there's a suit filed, and then there's a settlement of that suit, and nobody wants their name in the paper, and so they sign non-disclosure agreements, and everybody goes away. Well, the problem is then the organization that was the offending organization, or where the employees or the participants were, they don't, there's no bad publicity for them, which is sort of something which would be something that they deserve to get some bad publicity. But the issue seemed to be, for many people in the hockey world, was that Hockey Canada was deceptive about it. They had this trust fund, which they denied, and that's where the money came from. And they denied that it came from player fees and registration fees. Well, of course, that was the case, that it came from there. So what do you do instead? These are what they call uninsured liabilities. You can't just take out insurance for these. I know they're talking with their insurance company on this, but there's a real issue of whether the insurance, their insurance, would cover sexual assault allegations and settlements. So it was similar to the diocese case in this. I know, people were very offended that you would be paying out, sexual assault survivor settlements from, collections, and the money that people donated to the church. And, well, money's got to come from somewhere. It's not going to come from insurance. Hockey Canada may have other access to funds from sponsors, but everybody's going to be offended if you think about where the money came from. But it has to be paid, and, their survivors deserve to be paid and compensated. So I think people are going to have to get over that part of it as to where the money comes from. I mean, in Hockey Canada's case, you may think, well, these are rich hockey players now, but these were junior hockey players at the time, so they didn't have that. And, if we're trying to think of a broad principle of how we deal with these things, most of the time you're not going to be dealing with millionaire or future millionaire or potential millionaire, offenders. So it's the organizations themselves, like Hockey Canada, like the church, like, whatever organization, universities, if it's a professor or something. So there's lots of, that is going to be the system that unfolds. The non-disclosure agreements. Well, do you ban non-disclosure agreements? Well, in that case, then the offending organization and the victim's name would be public. And the victim, rightfully wouldn't want their name public. They didn't do anything wrong to deserve that. And, there's a stigma that goes with having your name publicized. And it doesn't seem effective anyway. I mean, these are negotiated. So I saw the PEI recommendation or precedent was, well, make it voluntary. I mean, you can sign a non-disclosure agreement, but you don't have to. Well, to me, that's going to lead to non-disclosure agreements, because that'll be part of the negotiation. You say, okay, you want that settlement? Sign this non-disclosure agreement. Okay, you won't sign that? Well, the settlement's going down then. So it's it's something that would be back and forth among the lawyers and the parties. To me, if you're going to ban the non-disclosure agreement, then there has to be a compromise. And I think it would be similar, actually, to the way that the diocese claims were handled. You have the organization can be named, the amount can be named, but not the victim. The victim's name could be kept confidential, but the fact of the settlement and the organization that made the payout, those would be made public. Of course, Hockey Canada has other issues. I mean, they have to fix the systemic issues and have developed new leadership and do all these things. But, if we're looking at the bigger picture, what do we do provincially with these non-disclosure agreements on sexual assault cases? I think a compromise, like I've just described, is probably the way forward. Other kinds of settlements, non-sexual assault related settlements, there's often, personal injury cases. There's often non-disclosure agreements. All that's done. Wouldn't be opposed to thinking about those in these terms too, that maybe those could be disclosed, just not the name of the victim. All right, so next one I want to talk about, that's Hockey Canada. Next one is the Dalhousie Street Party. I'm just going to make a few comments here. I was at my own homecoming at Acadia last weekend, and we were thinking about the Dalhousie students. I feel really bad for the students. I'm going to say that. Everything that, first of all, contrary to the way it was some years ago, everything that they're doing now is captured on video or is captured on something, and it's publicized. All of the stupid little mistakes and things you do when you're 18 to 20, in that range, they're with you forever. Wasn't always the case. The issue with Dalhousie was they had the street parties on homecoming weekend. They had a big crowd of people and expectation that there's going to be something going on. But Dalhousie wouldn't host anything on campus, and so it forced everything into the streets, and then so everything is even more so public on, thinking from the students' perspective. Now, what's the university's issue here? They're worried about their insurance coverage. If something went wrong, if they host an event on campus, well, most of the first-year students are 18. They're not able to consume alcohol. If it's a big homecoming party, everybody's going to want to be consuming alcohol, or a significant number of people would be. And so, what do? I'm sure their lawyers and their insurance companies were telling them, no, just don't do it. You don't want to take on this responsibility. If you have an event on campus and you enforce these rules too strictly, you see somebody that looks like they might be under the influence, well, you send them away. Well, that's going to drive everybody off campus anyway. And if you enforce it too lightly and you have a bunch of drunk 18-year-olds at your on-campus event, then, there's all kinds of trouble there too. And that would draw liability, especially if something happens and it's like, well, what did you do? Were you checking on people? How closely were you checking? Not very close. Well, then the university itself will be liable, not just whoever caused the incident that injured a student. So, but in fact, these events on campus are a good thing for those, even, so an 18-year-old shows up and they've been consuming something, and, why not have them on campus for a few hours at an event, give them a chance to sober up and straighten out a little bit. Not the worst thing. But what Dalhousie's really doing is transferring their liability to the city of Halifax and to the community, and, that's unfair too. So I think next year, Dalhousie, I heard them, officials from Dalhousie being interviewed, and they're like, oh, this is such a confusing situation and everybody's trying to figure out what to do. Here's what you do. You have an event on campus, you host it, and you take the hit if there is one. You don't send it out to the streets, affecting the neighborhoods. The other thing, of course, is, change the age. Why is it 19 still? Where you have to wait until you're 19. Most students, that means second year university, and it just drives things underground and out into the street, and we've seen the results. Okay, that's Dalhousie. Next thing I want to talk about is the town of Antigonish, county of Antigonish. I was going to say amalgamation, but they've purposefully, I know it's consolidation. They have purposefully avoided using the word amalgamation because there's a little history there. Back in 2006, anyway, there's a plebiscite on amalgamation. Town voted heavily against it. County voted heavily in favor of it. There was a UARB hearing. Very divisive, very difficult times in Antigonish. I wasn't involved at that time, but I know enough of the history of it. So there's the legal side of this is this: if they wanted to amalgamate, or if they wanted to create a regional municipality, which is allowed under the Municipal Government Act, that would involve a vote by the people, a plebiscite, a vote up or down. So that seems like something that both councils want to avoid, so that it doesn't divide people as it did in prior years. So what's the other alternative? Well, in the Municipal Government Act, if a town dissolves, and we've seen this here in Guysborough with Canso, the town of Canso dissolved. We're seeing this now unfolding a little bit in Victoria County with the Badek Village Commission. They're under financial trouble and they're looking at dissolving. Well, that's usually what happens. Somebody's in trouble, the town is in trouble financially, and they need to be absorbed into the larger county. That's not the case here. The town and county of Antigonish are both doing well financially. They're both stable, but there's some savings, significant savings, particularly actually with their RCMP contracts, that if they take this method of dissolving the town and having it absorbed into the county, that the county's RCMP contract allows that, where if they were to create a new municipality, that would not be the case. And they would have to renegotiate that contract with the RCMP, potentially lead to significant cost increases. So there was a vote on this Thursday night by both the town and county councils. The town passed it 4-3, so very narrow margin. County passed in favor of this consolidation plan 5-3, although there were 2 abstentions in the county council on conflicts of interest. Now, in the news articles on this, they didn't identify them, but I know the conflicts in both cases. One county councillor works for the town, and so is an employee there at the town, and would have something at stake personally with the outcome, potentially. So this is a question: is this a conflict? And the other, his daughter, I think, works for the municipality or the town, and so there's a conflict, potential conflict there. Well, that was a question. There's a Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, which talks about that. And they talk about a pecuniary interest, so a financial interest. If you have a financial interest in the outcome, then you're not supposed to vote. You're supposed to recuse yourself. There's very serious consequences. You can be removed as a councillor, and there's other, other fines as well. Well, it was an interesting thing because in their material, describing how this is going to unfold, the municipalities said, well, the employees are going to be looked after. They'll be fine. Particularly with the town, because the employees at the town are unionized. There's lots of rules there about, a new organization has to take on the union contract, has to respect the unionization decision that the employees have made. Okay, so in a sense, you'd say, all right, well, the employees don't have anything at stake. But really, the employees are probably the ones with the most at stake. So, to determine whether there was a conflict, you'd say, well, was there a pecuniary interest? Was there a financial interest in the decision? Well, right now, the councillor, the other councillor's child, they have jobs. If there's a consolidation, and do they both need full recreation departments, the same public works staffing levels, all of those things? Maybe that's not the same. So probably there was at least a risk that there would have been declared a real conflict there. So I don't blame them for recusing themselves. It would have been a risky thing to vote. But, on such a serious issue, it's difficult to have 2 abstentions on a vote. Those 2 abstentions, had they voted, potentially could have been made it a tie vote, and then, wouldn't have moved forward. So the next step, I'll be following this as it unfolds too, because it's not over. Both councils have agreed to this plan, but it now requires that there be a, special legislation from the province to enact this and do the finish off the consolidation. Now, presumably, the province has already been approached, the provincial government, that is, to see whether they're going to agree to this, where if the councils voted in favor of it. So that's presumably already arranged. But I wonder now, will the province be satisfied with the narrow margin, particularly given the 2 abstentions of in the county councillors' vote? Will the province be satisfied to go ahead on that basis? We'll see. Makes a lot of sense in a certain sense, of course, mostly because of development right on the edge of town. I mean, there's a lot of artificial decisions that get made if there's two political entities there, a town and a county, whereas if it was just one entity, you would just allow the development to sort of naturally unfold where the market dictated it, which would be the case, in future if there's a consolidation. Okay, final thing I want to talk about is this call with Brenda Lucki, the Commissioner of the RCMP, Nova Scotia RCMP leadership. This was April 28th, so, a week and a bit after the mass casualty. The recording of this meeting had been, rumored to exist, but we were told it had been deleted. Turns out things don't get deleted. This was not deleted. But it was interesting because, Brenda Lucki, the commissioner, described the meeting in one way, but the communications officer for the RCMP in Nova Scotia, Leah Scanlon, had described Commissioner Lucki's tone as abusive at the time, and, she felt very disrespected, and it was, all these terrible things about it. Darren Campbell, Superintendent Darren Campbell, had talked about political interference being discussed in the meeting. That there was a promise that was referenced from Commissioner Lucki to Public Safety Minister Blair that they were going to talk about the guns that were used by the killer in this press conference. They weren't done. Well, now we have the recording, so everybody can tell from themselves. And I see some not everybody agrees with my take on this, but that's fine. But I listened to the recordings when they came out, and I thought it was a very respectful tone from Commissioner Lucki. She never raised her voice. She was persistent, like she would say, "Hey, why didn't this happen?" And there was sort of not really an explanation from Deputy or Assistant Commissioner Lee Bergerman, who was the commanding officer in Nova Scotia at the time. All right, and so then Commissioner Lucki says, "Yeah, okay, but there were these other issues too. I tried to get a timeline from you for last Thursday. That didn't happen. I was trying to get situation reports from you. Usually I get them every day without even being asked. I've only gotten 2 from you. Like, this is very slow. This is very bad communications, between the national leadership team and the provincial Nova Scotia leadership team." And so that was really the thrust of her discussion and her comments to the Nova Scotia team was, this is just overall communications. Well, like I said, she never raised her voice. I thought it was, respectful, almost gentle, almost like a teacher when you didn't do your homework. Well, you should have done your homework. Why didn't you? And the first, the first unsatisfying answer wasn't enough. Okay, well, I'm going to keep pressing you. Why didn't you do it? So there was nothing, I didn't think, disrespectful about her tone or the content of what she was saying. There was and so she was describing how, Commissioner Lucki was describing how, you told me you were going to get me this timeline, so I told the Public Safety Minister, I'll get you this timeline, and then I don't get it from you, so I can't give it to them, so I look, I look bad, we all look bad, we're being chewed up in the media, we need to do better. There was a little bit of taking responsibility on the Nova Scotia side. Sharon Tessier took some responsibility, apologized, but didn't really explain what was going on. And Brenda Lucki says, listen, we offered you communications help. We offered it a few times that we'd send people down and help you out. And you said, no, we're fine. Well, obviously you weren't fine. So, let's talk about that. So, she was pressing the matter a little bit, but not, like I say, nothing disrespectful. The question came out, was there political interference, or was there an indication of political interference based on what she said? To me, it's not crystal clear that it was or wasn't. What she says was, the very first of the first recording, she starts off with, flew it up the flagpole because it was a request from the minister's office. Well, what was that request? Was the request to insert the particular things in the statement, or was it a request for what are you going to say in the press conference? because everything else that Commissioner Lucky said about this meeting has turned out to be accurate now that we have the recording, and nobody knew we were going to have the recording, but what she described was accurate. What Darren Campbell and Leah Scanlon described about the meeting was not accurate. So now when we get to this point and it's, well, was it, political interference or whatever? There's no reference to a promise. The word promise isn't used in these recordings. It is, talking about a request from the minister's office. Well, Brenda Luckie in her testimony said that the request was, tell me what you're going to say so that they'll know what's going to be said. The other thing is, the explanation from Nova Scotia had been, well, there was this ongoing investigation and we couldn't release the makes and models. That wasn't brought up in this meeting at all. There was discussion of, you told me Brenda Luckie saying, you told me it was going to be said in the statement. I told the minister, and by the way, not only was it not in the statement, but it wasn't going to be mentioned at all, except there was a question asked about what makes and models were used. So she was, disappointed in all that. Well, at no point did Superintendent Campbell or anybody on the Nova Scotia side say, but Commissioner, there's this ongoing investigation and we couldn't possibly release the makes and models because we're close to, nailing somebody on the U.S. side, or we're doing there was no description whatsoever of whatever this ongoing investigation might have entailed. So, their credibility on that question is really diminished now that we've heard the recording. That's my take on it, as at least. So, we'll see. We'll see what unfolds if there's going to be more comments this week about the Mass Casualty Commission recording. Okay, so that's it. That's it for the first episode. Like I said, we covered the Emergencies Act inquiry, Hockey Canada and non-disclosure agreements in sexual assault cases, the Dalhousie Homecoming, Street Party, Antigonish Town and County consolidation, and then these new recordings released by the Mass Casualty Commission. Some fascinating stuff. Hope you've enjoyed this format. Look forward to comments, and we'll be back next week with some follow-up on some of these stories and some other news stories to add into the mix, and so hopefully you'll join me then. All right, so thanks again for watching. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.